This is destroying your relationship. And you don't even notice. It's not what the other person did. It's not the lack of love. It's not fate, time, or chance. It's something much more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. Carl Jung would call it a hidden mechanism of the psyche, an invisible force operating behind your gestures, choices, and silences, shaping the way you relate to others and to yourself. Have you noticed how the same patterns repeat? The same pains, the same distances, the same angry words, even when everything seemed to be going well. It's not a coincidence. There's an underground thread guiding you, an unconscious script you are following without knowing. And it's sabotaging your ability to love and be loved. But there's something almost no one sees about this. Something that may be creating distance right now where there should be connection. And the scariest part, the more you try to fix it, the stronger it becomes. Carl Jung explained that we are governed not only by what we know, but mainly by what we choose to ignore. And it is precisely this that destroys our relationships. What is in the shadow, outside the light of consciousness? In this video, you won't hear obvious advice. You'll be led through a journey where every word brings you closer to a truth you may have always felt, but never had the courage to face. A truth that can transform the way you love and love yourself. But are you ready to see what's behind the mirror? What we deny in ourselves, we end up meeting as fate. Carl Jung. Have you ever felt that no matter how hard you try, love always seems to slip through your fingers? As if every time something begins to bloom, a silence, an absence, a misunderstanding arises without warning, and before you know it, everything collapses. There is a mistake so silent, so deeply rooted that it operates without making noise, but its presence is devastating. It's the kind of flaw that doesn't scream. It whispers inside you. This mistake is confusing connection with control. It's believing the other person is there to fill a void, to save us from our own insecurities. Without realizing it, we approach not out of love, but out of neediness. We expect the other to heal wounds we never dared to look at directly. And when they fail in this invisible mission they never agreed to fulfill, we feel betrayed, abandoned, rejected. What few understand is that the root of all this lies in the unconscious. That's where we store unresolved childhood pain, forgotten rejections, fears we've learnt to hide from ourselves. These invisible marks silently write the rules of our relationships, and unless we face them with courage, we will keep repeating the same stories with different people. It's as if we were trapped in a theatre, always playing the same role, the one who loves too much and suffers, the one who gives everything and is not seen, the one who always ends up alone. Each of these characters is a reflection of something that lives in the shadow of our psyche, the part of us that was excluded, repressed, forgotten. But it's still there, waiting to be heard. And that's exactly where the mistake lies. Because while we search for love outside, we ignore the inner voice crying for attention. This disconnection from our emotional world creates unrealistic expectations of the other. We expect them to be shelter, salvation, healing. And we forget that no relationship can bear the weight of an internal void left unaddressed. This cycle repeats silently. And the cruelest part is that with each failed attempt, we reinforce an unconscious belief. I am not enough. Love is not for me. I will always be abandoned. And so, without realizing it, we feed the same pattern we so desperately try to escape. It's a form of self-sabotage, so sophisticated, it looks at first glance like inevitable fate. But there is one detail that changes everything. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Imagine that every relationship is like a mirror, and that everything you see in the other what attracts you, what irritates you, what hurts you, is a reflection of something within yourself. What you love in the other is what you long to develop in yourself. What bothers you reveals parts of yourself that you reject, buried in the shadow. And that's where the real journey of self-love begins, when you stop running from yourself. The great turning point comes when we realize that the real mistake is not in others, nor in how they treat us. The invisible mistake lies in how we disconnect from our essence, in how we ignore our emotional patterns and project onto others the impossible mission of completing us. When that changes, everything changes. And then everything makes sense. But that takes us to something even deeper. You don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. At first glance, we believe we choose our partners based on affinities, values, or even simple attraction. But that's just the surface. The truth is that many of these choices are made by a part of you that you don't know, a silent, deep part that operates behind the scenes of the mind, the unconscious. It is the true director of the stories you live, including the ones about love. Have you ever wondered why you are always drawn to the same type of person? Why do certain patterns repeat even after so much pain? The answer lies in the emotional memories that live within you, experiences that were often buried, unresolved but still remain, determining who you consider familiar, safe, or even exciting. What few people understand is that the unconscious seeks, above all, what is familiar, not what is good for you. It is guided by unresolved emotions, old ties, open childhood wounds, and so you may find yourself falling for someone who, without realizing it, produces exactly the type of love that hurt you the most. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. And for the unconscious, familiar means safe. That's why so often, true love seems boring, too calm, lacking that emotional chaos we often confuse with intensity. Because chaos is what the unconscious recognizes, and until we make it conscious, we will remain trapped in repetition, loving pain as if it were destiny. But there's something even more surprising in all of this. The unconscious doesn't just choose for you, it tries through relationships to heal what was left behind. Each partner, each story, is an attempt to reenact an old wound in the hope of a new ending. Unconsciously, you expect the other to do what your parents couldn't. To see you, accept you, protect you, love you unconditionally. But the other person is not your healer. They also carry their own shadows, their own wounds. And when two unconscious minds meet, love turns into a battlefield. One's pain activates the other's, and what should have been a meeting becomes a silent war of unmet needs, of voids waiting to be filled. This takes us to something even deeper. To know your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of others. Carl Jung. Transformation begins when you take responsibility for your internal process. When you stop asking, why does the other do this to me? And start asking, what in me is allowing, attracting, or tolerating this? This shift in focus is liberating, because it takes the power away from pain and returns the power of choice, a conscious choice. Changing this pattern doesn't require you to fight the unconscious. It requires you to know it, to dive into it with curiosity and courage, to listen to its messages, recognize its wounds, welcome its shadows. Only then can you choose freely. Only then will the next time you fall in love be with someone who resonates with your light and not your pain. And in the end, the answer was always there. But this brings us to a simple and revealing force called test. Until you become conscious, the unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. There is a silent, almost uncomfortable but deeply transformative exercise. Carl Jung proposed that by observing the patterns that most bother us in others, especially in those we relate to intimately, we can discover what is hidden in ourselves. Because what hurts us most, irritates us, or inexplicably attracts us, rarely has to do with the other. This test, simple at first glance, consists of observing, with brutal honesty, the behaviours that most trigger your emotions in a relationship. And then asking, what does this say about me? Not superficially, but going beyond guilt, pride, or pain. This is a portal to access the emotional patterns operating in your unconscious, the ones silently shaping how you love, demand, run away, or surrender. Have you noticed how you repeat yourself in the same situations? How you react the same way when you feel ignored? How you shut down or explode when you feel rejected? These are deep, almost automatic traits. They are the clues. They are like footprints left by your shadow, pointing to where the unresolved pain lies, the unacknowledged fear, the still wounded inner child. What few people realize is that when we judge the other, we reveal more about ourselves than about them. The criticism, the discomfort, the exaggerated reaction, all of this are projections of the unconscious. When Jung said that we see the world not as it is, but as we are, he was inviting us to turn the mirror inward, to see that the greatest conflicts in relationships are not caused by differences, but by the non-acceptance of who we are and what we deny. And this test doesn't end with observation. It requires interaction, a daily choice to pause, breathe, and ask, is this really about the other? Or about something in me I haven't yet embraced? And little by little, you begin to realize that self-love is not a destination. It's a process of bringing to light what once lived in the shadow. This takes us to something even more intimate. The shadow is what your personality does not want to be. Carl Jung. By recognizing the traits of your shadow projected onto others, you begin the path of reintegration. And that changes everything. Because from that point on, the relationship stops being a battlefield of unconsciousness and becomes a space of expansion. Pain becomes a portal, conflict a mirror, and the other a sacred ally for your evolution. This test is not a tool for judgment, but for liberation. It invites you to take the reins of your emotional path, to realize that relationships are, above all, a journey of self-discovery. That loving another is inevitably a reflection of your ability to love yourself, including the parts you've learnt to hide. And then the question changes from, why is this happening to me? To, what can I learn about myself from this? And the answer changes everything. But something even darker and liberating is lurking. We all carry a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Carl Jung. The shadow is not what you show to the world. It's what you hide even from yourself. Those traits you learnt to reject, vulnerability, anger, jealousy, dependence, neediness, not because they are bad, but because at some point in your story, being that way wasn't safe. And to be loved, you had to deny parts of yourself. But what is repressed doesn't disappear. It just becomes invisible and powerful. The emotional shadow acts as a hidden force that silently shapes your relationships. It sabotages without you noticing. It makes you attract unavailable people. It causes you to pull away when everything is going well. It turns you into someone who demands, controls, or hides, and then doesn't understand why love slips away. What few realize is that the shadow doesn't act alone. It feeds on shame, on the fear of not being accepted, on the need to be perfect. And the more you try to maintain this idealized image of yourself, strong, independent, balanced, the more power you give to what you're trying to hide. Because what is not looked at commands. Relationships then become arenas of confrontation between what you want to feel and what you fear feeling. And the shadow steps in when you least expect it. It appears in silences that scream, in outbursts you don't know where they came from, in the distancing you can't avoid. It's the shadow that repeats the stories, even when you swear this time it will be different. But there is a key in this labyrinth. Facing the shadow is the first step toward wholeness. Carl Jung. The great liberation happens when, instead of running from the shadow, you invite it to dance. When you recognize that all emotions, even the most uncomfortable ones, carry a message. Anger may be screaming for boundaries. Neediness may be asking for self-care. Jealousy may be begging for authenticity. And when you listen, something begins to heal. This healing is neither immediate nor comfortable. It requires courage. Courage to look within without masks, to accept that self-sabotage is not a flaw in character, but an unconscious attempt at protection, that behind every mistake, there is a story, and that only compassion can dissolve the rigidity of self-criticism. Truly loving someone requires that you love yourself enough to recognize your shadows and welcome them. Because only those who embrace their own darkness can hold the light of another. And in that place, the relationship stops being an escape and becomes a path of mutual growth. But are we ready to accept that? This brings us to the essential question we all avoid. But that holds the answer we've been searching for. He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. Carl Jung. We've reached the point where everything converges. After exploring the invisible mistakes, the unconscious patterns, the deep tests and the dance with the shadow, the inevitable question echoes in the silence. How then can we create a relationship that not only survives, but flourishes? The answer is simple, but not easy. It requires presence, awareness, and above all, responsibility. Healthy relationships are not born from the absence of conflict, but from the mutual willingness to grow through it. True love is not free of shadows. It simply illuminates them more gently. And authenticity is not saying everything you think, but having the courage to show who you are, even at the risk of not being understood. It is in this space that self-love becomes foundation, not accessory. The ultimate method doesn't begin with the other. It begins with you. With the practice of listening to your own feelings before projecting them. With the choice to speak your truth, not to convince, but to reveal yourself. With the ability to withstand the discomfort of not being immediately met. Without resorting to drama, avoidance, or emotional punishment. This requires emotional re-education, a relearning of how to relate from a place of consciousness. It involves understanding that the unconscious is always trying to express itself, and that instead of suppressing it, you can use it as a compass. By integrating your shadows, you not only stop repeating patterns, but begin to create relationships where there is space for error, for forgiveness, for new beginnings. But there is one detail that completely transforms this journey. No one changes without pain. People will do anything to avoid facing their own soul. Carl Jung. And that is precisely why so few live love in its purest form. Because building something real requires letting the false die. It requires giving up idolizations, games, inherited conditioning. It demands courage to be vulnerable. To say, I'm afraid. I don't know how to do it, but I want to try. And that is power. The method is simple: presence. Not physical presence, but emotional. To be there whole when the other shows their pain. Not running away, not judging. Just being a clean mirror where they can see themselves without distortion. And for that, you must first have done this work with yourself. Be your own mirror. Be your own home. In the end, an authentic relationship is one where both have the freedom to be who they are and the commitment to become who they can be, where love is not a bargaining chip, but a sacred space of mutual transformation. And when that happens, the relationship stops being a necessity and becomes a choice. And now, what does that mean for you? By now, maybe you're wondering, if all of this was inside me all along, why didn't I see it? The answer is as simple as it is unsettling. Because looking inward takes more courage than facing the world. We are conditioned to seek outside what has always been here, at the very center of our being. Can you see it now? It wasn't the others, it wasn't the failed relationships, the broken promises, or the heavy silences. It was the echo of the unconscious. It was the unintegrated shadow. It was the story you told yourself and believed to protect yourself from feeling all that seemed too big, too deep, too painful. And then everything makes sense. Carl Jung always warned us, as long as we ignore the unconscious, it will continue to rule our lives under the name of fate, the love that leaves, the partner who doesn't stay, the painful repetitions. These are not punishments. They are invitations. Invitations to descend into the depths of the soul and rescue the part of us we left behind. True liberation is not in changing the other, but in changing the lens, in recognizing that every loving encounter is a mirror, and that behind every pain there is a desperate attempt to love better, to love more truthfully, to love with awareness. In the end, the answer was always there, but are we ready to accept that? Do we have the courage to stop seeking love and start becoming love itself? If you've made it this far, something within you has already begun to move, because the truth is, what really destroys our relationships is not the other. It's the disconnection from ourselves. It's the parts we choose not to look at. It's the unconscious patterns we repeat without realizing. It's the shadow trying to scream while we pretend not to hear. But now you've seen it, and what has been seen can no longer be unseen. The love you're looking for out there begins in the silence of your own soul, in the welcoming of your wounds, in listening to your most hidden emotions. It's in the reunion with the unconscious, with your shadow, with what you try to repress. That true self-love is born. And from that place, relationships stop being a source of pain and become a space of healing. Carl Jung taught us that there is no transformation without descent. That light only makes sense when we acknowledge the darkness, and that by making peace with what is most human in us, we open the way to a more conscious, more whole, more real love. Now is the time to take the first step. Start applying these ideas today. Not as a formula, but as an invitation to truth. Observe your relationships. Listen to your reactions. Note what repeats. Question with compassion. And little by little, you'll realize that the change is not in the other. It's in how you relate to yourself. Tell me in the comments, what part of this reflection resonated most with you? Which of these truths have you always felt, but maybe didn't yet have the courage to face? Or if you've already begun this journey of self-discovery, share your experience. Your story might reach someone still lost in the middle of the path. And if you want to go even deeper into this process of transformation, I've left a video above that will expand this awareness even further. Every second is worth it. See you in the next video.